It's no secret that the Nazis committed insane crimes. But how did they pay for them?
I'm Knox, and today I'll tell you a few stories
About incredibly cruel people who received their due reward, the death penalty. And yes, sometimes at the hands of ordinary people. What did they do to them?
Watch until the end to find out. I'll start with the show trials that were held to boost public morale and demonstrate that everyone would be punished.
In December 1943, Kharkov became the stage for the first such trial of German war criminals. On the defendant's bench were 3 Germans: Captain Wilhelm Landheld, SS Untersturmführer Hans Rietz, and Senior Corporal of the Secret Police Reinhard Retzlaw. Beside them sat collaborator Mikhail Bulanov, who was a driver for the gas van, a mobile gas chamber. They had been killing hundreds of people for years, fearing nothing. But even the gas van was just the tip of the iceberg. Landheld and Ritz were charged with the execution of thousands during the occupation. Can you imagine? The punishment was swift and brutal. On December 19th, the condemned were executed in the Bazaar Square. About 40,000 people gathered to witness this gruesome spectacle. Eyewitnesses recall how the crowd suddenly fell silent, then erupted in noise like a dense forest during a storm. At that moment, the vehicles with the condemned arrived. A woman's voice, full of anger and passion, cut through the air with a cry, "There they are! Oh, those filthy Germans!" The crowd cheered as the criminals swung from the noose. Only a few couldn't bear to watch and left the square. Do you think it's cruel? But you can't even imagine what the people who survived the occupation went through and what they did to their tormentors afterward. A similar public execution took place in Kiev. On January 17, 1946, a trial began that soon became known as the Kiev Nuremberg. 12 German soldiers, including SS Gruppenführer Paul Scheer, responsible for mass shootings of Jews and locals, were sentenced to death. Former military commandant of Kiev Karl Burkhardt, known for his brutality and the rape of local girls who were shot after his visits, also faced execution. What did he do to them? One can only guess. These beasts met their end on the gallows. Interestingly, the execution attracted an enormous crowd, about 200,000 people. But the events of that day were not without incidents. During the execution, Colonel Georg Trukenbrot's rope broke. However, the execution proceeded. The vehicle was brought back, and the rope was replaced, ensuring the sentence was carried out. The Soviet newspaper Pravda reported that the numerous workers gathered on Khreshchatyk in the center of Kiev greeted the execution with universal approval. It was noted that war veterans on crutches approached the hanged bodies and struck them. Local boys even swung on the legs of the corpses like swings. It was a public celebration.
Harsh, right?
These public executions continued until 1946, when the last one took place on February 3rd in Riga. 7 high-ranking executioners, including Friedrich Jeckeln, chief of the SS and police of the Reichskommissariat Ostland, were sent to the gallows. The execution was carried out in Uzvaras Park. Those who came to watch the execution got soaked in the rain, waiting for the condemned who were 4 hours late. However, plans to leave the bodies on display for 3 days were disrupted. The situation got out of control when the crowd tore the pants off Jeckeln's body and began to tear it apart. Authorities decided to remove the bodies earlier to prevent further desecration. Why such cruelty? Jeckeln personally participated in mass shootings. He drove children, especially boys, to prevent a generation of traitors from growing up under the German regime. So, I can understand the people of Riga. These series of executions were not just grim acts of retribution, but also an attempt by authorities to remind Soviet citizens of the culprits behind their hardships during post-war recovery and famine. They aimed to quell potential protests by showing harsh treatment of criminals.
Do you think it was fair?
But not all sentences were handed down by officials. Sometimes people took matters into their own hands with incredible rage and hatred. For example, in a military unit report from 1942, it is mentioned that Scout Tikhonov from a reconnaissance platoon repeatedly failed to bring back a live enemy. Each time he was sent on a mission to capture a tongue, he returned with empty, bloodied hands. Why? After learning about the atrocities committed by the fascists in his native village and the brutal rape and murder of his sisters, Tikhonov beat the captured prisoners to death with his fists. And yes, no one tried to stop him. A year later, he was just transferred to another position. In another case, the villagers of Shpakovsky, Novomishsky district, Yaroslavl region, who were working on the construction of a military airfield, recognized a former camp guard from Koldichevo among the peasants. What happened there? 22,000 Soviet citizens were exterminated in that camp. Can you imagine? The peasants captured the executioner and reported to a passing lieutenant. He ordered the guard to be tied to the tail of a horse, which was then set off at a gallop, scattering the executioner's body across the entire airfield. Documented cases also exist where Vlasovites, trying to escape execution after being handed over by the Allies, were crushed by tanks. Or here's another case where a tank platoon, under the cover of night, captured a village where the garrison surrendered almost without a fight. The soldiers decided to place the prisoners in a barn while deciding their fate. However, upon opening the barn doors, the tankers found a shocking scene. Children hung from one crossbar, arranged by height from tallest to shortest, and opposite them on another crossbar were domestic animals, cats and dogs, hung in the same order. The sight of this horrific scene stunned the officers present. One of the mechanics drivers, outraged by what he saw, started the tank and drove into the crowd of Nazi prisoners, crushing several people under the tracks. After burying the children and animals in a mass grave, the remaining prisoners were forced to remove the crushed bodies to the barn. But this was just the beginning of the revenge. The tankers drove all the surviving Nazis into the barn and shot it to pieces with tank guns. The air smelled of gunpowder and burning flesh. Horrific. Such brutal execution methods were common among partisans. Often, captured Nazis were simply shot on the spot. In winter, sometimes a captured German would be stripped naked, frozen, and have their genitals cut off. The resulting sculpture would be placed in a visible spot by the road with a sign containing offensive content showing the Nazis their fate. But these were not the only methods of execution. Executioners were often drowned in swamps, a resource-efficient method when ammunition was scarce. Another form of execution, adopted in response to Nazi actions, involved forcing Germans to run through minefields until all were dead. This was borrowed from the Nazis themselves, who sent civilians to clear roads of mines, resulting in many deaths from explosions. War bred countless instances of cruelty, and documented evidence confirms the actions of so-called wild partisans who acted independently, ignoring military rules and avenging their murdered compatriots with extreme brutality. But it wasn't only in the Soviet army that such methods were used. In the American occupation zone after the war, there were so-called death squads under the command of Major Murray Barons, motivated by a desire to avenge the annihilated Jews. What did they do? These units acted very ingeniously, employing various cruel methods to kill Nazis, including throwing them out of windows, drowning, and blowing them up with grenades. There were several documented cases where Nazi executioners, directly involved in shooting women and children, were literally torn apart. They were tied between military vehicles, which then moved in opposite directions, stretching their bodies and making them suffer. They were not allowed to die quickly. The actions of these American groups remain the subject of research, and according to some American historians, the number of death squad victims could have reached several thousand. Can you imagine that level? Similar organized death squads existed in the USSR. Partisans under the command of Alexei Fedorov were notably cruel. They beat policemen to a peat hot pulp, cut them with knives, set their hair on fire, dragged them through the forest tied by their legs, poured hot tea and boiling water over them, not letting their wounds heal. Fedorov sometimes allowed a partisan to hit a policeman, blow his nose in his face, and then shoot him. In the diary of Commander Grigory Belitsky, he described how partisans dealt with spies caught at the unit's headquarters. One spy, brought early in the morning, was beaten to death with sticks, had clubs shoved up his rear, and then was scalded with boiling water. In the village of Glushevka, Kursk region, a group of policemen was captured. To avoid taking everyone with them, the partisan group commander announced that only half would go to the camp, and the policemen had to decide who would stay. Locked in a barn, they beat each other to death with firewood. The survivors were shot. Often prisoners were bayoneted, a method typical of both wild partisans and regular units. No one was punished for such actions, but that was how they dealt with ordinary Nazis.
How did they execute the top brass of the Third Reich?
In October 1946, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Germany's foreign minister from 1938 to 1945, and an SS Obergruppenführer, was found guilty on all counts: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. As a result, he was sentenced to death by hanging. The execution took place on the night of October 16, 1946, in the gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison, where 10 sentenced individuals were hanged one by one, with Ribbentrop being the first. In his final statement before the court, Ribbentrop claimed that Germany's foreign policy, which he directed, was not aimed at establishing world domination, but at correcting the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles and providing food for the German people. He expressed regret only that his plans had failed, feeling guilty before his people, but not before the court. Ribbentrop appeared pale and unsteady, with half-closed eyes, seemingly in a daze. His hands were tied behind his back, and before stepping onto the gallows, he was told to loudly state his name. Standing on the trap door, realizing his final moments were slipping away, Ribbentrop uttered his last words: "God protect Germany. My last wish is that Germany remains united, that there be an understanding between the East and the West." Thus ended the life of a man who played a key role in Nazi Germany's diplomacy, issuing ultimatums to countries and entire peoples. But believe me, he wasn't the most insane person from the Nazi elite. Have you heard about the ideologist of the Third Reich? Julius Streicher would walk around Nuremberg armed with a heavy whip to punish those he disliked. Sometimes Streicher would suddenly appear in the Nuremberg prison, where he would start torturing prisoners, enjoying the process, especially when his victims were utterly defenseless. Stories of his atrocities were known throughout Franconia. He mutilated and raped, reveling in his power. But his scandalous behavior wasn't limited to cruelty. Streicher was also known for his passion for pornography, an endless string of mistresses, and his habit of extorting money from their husbands. He amassed a fortune by speculating on property seized from Jews. At the Nuremberg trials, Streicher was accused not so much for specific actions, but for propaganda. He was considered one of the key figures inciting violence against Jews and strengthening Nazi power in Germany. Ultimately, he was found guilty of crimes against humanity and became, essentially, the spiritual mentor of those who committed horrors in the Treblinka concentration camp. On October 16, 1946, Streicher was executed by hanging.
And I simply must tell you about the trial and death of one of the most important figures of Nazi Germany.
In October 1946, the atmosphere in Nuremberg was tense and full of anticipation. Approaching the tribunal building, where the most notorious figures of Nazi Germany were being tried, generals and ministers of the Third Reich gave way to a tall man with a smile on his face. This man was Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal of the Luftwaffe and one of Germany's most significant leaders, who had been captured alive. Göring was a real hero in his youth during World War I. By the age of 21, he was already an experienced pilot, credited with 22 aerial victories. His encounter with Adolf Hitler happened by chance in a Munich restaurant, where the future Führer was giving a speech about Germany's revival. Göring joined the Nazi Party, investing family funds into it, which was a decisive step for his future career. By 1933, when Hitler officially took power, Göring was already by his side as a loyal associate. He was involved in organizing the first concentration camps, creating the Gestapo, and developing mechanisms of political terror. One of his most significant achievements was the creation of the Luftwaffe, a powerful air force that played a key role in World War II. Yes, this man initiated the death camps and the bombs that fell on civilians. At the Nuremberg tribunal sessions, Göring tried to appear confident and even joked, hoping to justify himself and survive. However, his hopes were shattered when he was sentenced to death by hanging with no right to pardon. To avoid a disgraceful end, Göring chose death by poison, which he managed to keep despite constant surveillance. He died with a smirk on his face and one eye closed, winking at those who failed to kill him. It's clear that now we all stand for humanity and adherence to the law. But when millions of civilians were dying, it was hard to keep anything human inside. And by the way, if you can write scripts, edit videos, or voiceover clips, contact our Telegram bot via the link in the description. We would be happy to collaborate with you.
Thanks for watching.